Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video that is all about Suetonius. This is essentially the Suetonius video. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about The 12 Caesars by Suetonius, which is a book that I have recently been rereading. Though not in full, I've kind of been hopping around reading my favorite emperors because this is a history of the first 12 Caesars of the Roman Empire. And so you can kind of hop around. You can read which emperor you're most interested in at any given time. But this is one of the most famous ancient histories out there, and in my opinion, that is with good reason. I think it's very readable, it's very approachable, and a lot of times when people ask me where to start with ancient classics, I'll often say that you can start here, because I remember reading this in college, and I really was not intimidated by this. I thought it was really easy, and in fact, I thought it was easier than a lot of the modern textbooks that we were required to read. And that's really why I wanted to make this video today, because I also often get questions about where should I start if I want to learn about Caesar, for example? If I want to learn about Augustus, where should I begin? And I think the natural inclination and probably the obvious way to start would be with some more modern nonfiction. But I'll be honest with you, I think the ancient histories are very readable, they're very direct, and they're not nearly as intimidating as you might think they are. And in many ways, like I said, I kind of find them a bit more approachable than modern nonfiction in many ways. Now, if you're looking for something that's maybe more encompassing and more detailed, then yes, I think a modern nonfiction will work really well for you. But if you really want to get to the heart of these sources, I think you can do it. And I think you can do it as a beginner to learning about the history of this time period. And some of y'all may take issue with me saying that because to a lot of people, Suetonius is very much a gossip monger. He's constantly talking about gossip. And so a lot of people will say, can we really take him seriously? Should we judge him as an accurate interpretation of the times? Get this. You should think that about modern nonfiction too. You should have those questions when you are reading any sort of historical nonfiction. What is the bias? What is the purpose? Why is it written like this? Suetonius is really, in many ways, no different than a modern nonfiction writer. So who was Suetonius? Gosh, he was so interesting. When you hear a little bit about his life, you understand why he was so interested in gossip. So he was born somewhere around 69 AD, and he died at some point after 122 AD. So he lived through some really interesting years in terms of Rome's history. He really worked his way up in the empire, and he eventually found himself in a pretty important imperial role. He was the secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. And so through that role, you can imagine that he had access to a lot of really important information about the history of the Caesars, but he also really had access to the imperial archives. And so that's why a lot of people will say, Suetonius is more accurate than some others because we know he was working with the primary sources 9 times out of 10. Things didn't really turn out all that well for Suetonius, though, because he was dismissed from service. He was dismissed from his job as the secretary when it was thought that he was having an affair with the Emperor Hadrian's wife. And so that's kind of why his death date is up in the air a bit. Suetonius was actually a fairly prolific writer, as so many of these ancient historians were. And unfortunately, the majority of what he wrote has been lost to the sands of time. Even the 12 Caesars has kind of come into the modern day a bit damaged because we don't have the first part of his life of Julius Caesar. I think we do have one kind of extant copy of the 12 Caesars that's from around Charlemagne's time, because Einhard, who was a member of Charlemagne's court, used Suetonius as kind of a backbone for writing his own biography of Charlemagne. So of course the 12 Caesars was one of those lucky ancient classics that remained incredibly popular throughout the medieval period. And as you can imagine, it really took off in the Renaissance with the rediscovery of classical learning. And why is that? What makes this one so special? Why was this so popular? Why was it still being read in the medieval period? Well, I think it's just that Suetonius is kind of funny. I think he's very approachable. I think he's kind of lighthearted. And to be a historian, he often feels like he's talking to you personally. But an important thing to keep in mind with the 12 Caesars is that it's not really what you would call straightforward history. It truly is a series of biographies. And biography as a genre was very new at the time in which Suetonius was writing. And so there are some really weird qualities to the writing here and there, especially if you're looking for a really straightforward narrative of what happened when. He does leave things out. His goal really is to tell you everything about the life of a certain individual. And if an event did not personally impact someone, he's not going to mention it. So sometimes you're reading this and you're wondering, gosh, when is he going to talk about X? He's not going to mention it. He's not going to talk about it because that wasn't personally relevant to this figure. And so that does make his writing kind of weird in places. And I think that's what some people really struggle with when they're trying to get into him and get a handle on his writing. That is just a tick that he has. He's not really interested in the whole picture. He's interested in the individual. And I think that's really what makes him valuable. So the 12 Caesars covers the reign of the first 12 emperors of the Roman Empire. So it goes from Julius Caesar, who was technically never an emperor, but we do have to include him, I guess, up to the reign of Domitian. There is a formula to the way that Suetonius likes to structure these little bios. So he really likes foreshadowing. So you'll often find that he opens up the chapter about the emperor with all of these omens that were talked about before his birth, talking about the family history, kind of talking about what is probably going to come next. There's always some line that just kind of sums up an emperor's reign that he mentions in the first few paragraphs. And you know that's kind of going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. What that sentence says is really an accurate representation of the emperor's life. He does this really well with Nero, actually, really, really well. And of course, of the first 12 emperors, some of them are more interesting than others. And so some of these chapters are really, really exciting. Some of these biographies are just absolutely fascinating. Some of them you feel like are just dragging. So this is a book I would say just read here and there. Pick it up every now and again when you feel like reading about an emperor or when you're really interested in the emperor at hand. I think that's what I'm doing this time, so I'm not going to try to read it in total. There's a very conversational quality to a lot of Suetonius's writing as well, because he's really using everything he can find to construct a narrative of this person's life. He's using not only his background as the imperial secretary to the emperor, so he's not only using the influence that he has there to look at actual primary sources in the imperial archives, but he listens to what other people are telling him, whether that's gossip or not. At the time in which he's living, he's really surrounded by people who can remember a lot of these emperors. And so he's asking for hearsay and gossip, which today we would not rely on, period. We really would not take that seriously. But most of what Suetonius talks about is corroborated elsewhere. So I think you can take him pretty seriously. Famously, he is one of the first historians to really talk about Julius Caesar's epilepsy. He will talk about the seizures that Caesar experienced. So he tries to include personal details like that alongside political achievements, which is what I think makes him a more compelling historian than some others. You can say he's really a bit more interested in the gossip than he is most anything else, and he sure is, and that's what makes him a great time. But as we all know, gossip can be true. And it seems like in a lot of cases in which Suetonius is relying on hearsay, he's getting a pretty accurate version of events. Now, I'll say for all the weirdnesses in his writing that I think could bother you, he does try to lay out a fairly linear portrait of events. I think the things that will catch you is where he sometimes leaves things out, and especially there in the first chapter on Julius Caesar, the part that was lost sets up a lot of what happens in Caesar's later life. And I think that's really good context that you probably need to understand a lot of what happened with Julius Caesar. But otherwise, I think the other emperors, he's very straightforward on. And I think it's very interesting the way that he structures the biography. The best thing about his writing to me, and really the thing that kind of keeps you going 9 times out of 10, in my opinion, are the quotes. Now, the argument is, did anybody say any of these quotes as he has them written? In my opinion, it doesn't really matter. I've spoken a lot about the fact that the ancient historians just aren't that interested in telling you a straightforward version of events, because to them, history is an art form at the same time. So it's got to be an enjoyable read. So they are going to imbue it with their own personal bias fairly blatantly, but they are also going to put words in people's mouths. Now, for instance, in many of these cases, we'll know that someone gave a speech at a certain time. And in the case of Augustus, for instance, Augustus wrote his own autobiography. So we can assume that Suetonius, being the secretary to the emperor, had access to a lot of information and probably had access to that autobiography. Letters were also extremely important in the Roman Empire, especially at this time. and a lot of those letters survived into the time in which Suetonius was writing. So again, you have to assume some of these quotes are actually real, and he's really getting them from someone's letters, from someone's documentation of events. They're so cool though. Literally, the first page of this has a stellar quote from Sulla, who is one of my absolute favorite figures from Roman history. Sulla was actually a figure from the end of the Republic, and he very famously participated in his own civil war. And so he and Caesar interacted with one another, and I think it's very interesting because there's so many parallels between them as figures. But here is the quote. Whether he was divinely inspired or showed peculiar foresight is an arguable point, but these were Sulla's words. Very well then, you win. But never forget that the man whom you want me to spare will one day prove the ruin of the party of Optimates which you and I have so long defended. There are many Mariuses in this fellow Caesar, because Sulla went up against a man named Marius. And that's an instance like what I was referring to earlier. That is an instance of foreshadowing, because Suetonius will write the rest of the biography in a way that you come back and view that line as really putting into perspective the entirety of Caesar's life. And that's, I think, the brilliance of him. Now, as I said, there are some ups and downs here. Some emperors are just far more interesting than others. That's not really Suetonius's fault. It's not as if he could give them more interest by writing about them interestingly. So for example, people like Titus just does not interest me at all. But men like Nero and Caligula will be a source of endless fascination for me until time immemorial. I love Nero specifically. I just love Nero, and I loved his Caligula. There's always this talk about Caligula that he was, of course, unstable, but he also really understood where he was at, and he understood that he had power over you and over anybody else. And so Suetonius will talk about when he's in the throes of passion with someone, he'll say to them, the only reason your head is still on your shoulders is because I want it there. At any time, I could say that I want you beheaded. And I feel like it's little instances and little vignettes like that that capture the essence of a person and that really kind of throw into sharp relief what they were all about. And that's what Suetonius is really interested in. Some ancient historians you read are very much just interested in the political career. Suetonius is interested in them as a person, which I think makes him a really fascinating figure to read. Now, Suetonius had a contemporary that I think it's very easy to compare him with, and that would be Tacitus. Tacitus and Suetonius are alive at the same time. They're writing at the same time. They have a mutual friend in Pliny, so they probably knew each other, or at least were aware of each other in their professional circles. Tacitus wrote most famously the Annals. That's what I would say is most comparable to the 12 Caesars, and a lot of people will compare them as writers because they're talking about broadly the same period of time. I have always liked Suetonius more. Tacitus is sexist in a way that is off-putting to me. And you may say to me, Jenny, it was the Roman Empire. Was anyone not misogynistic? And you know, that is such a valid question. It really is. But to me, Tacitus is so blatant in it. He'll often blame women for the problems that the emperors are having. Suetonius will occasionally do that, but to me, he does it during instances where it is warranted, where we know for sure the woman really was a character. But Tacitus is not trying to tell his version of events in a similar way to Suetonius at all. He's very much straightforward, linear. He's not really looking at it so much through the lens of biography or biography the way that Suetonius is doing it. And so I do think there's an obvious point of comparison, and some people really prefer one to the other. I, for my money, like Suetonius a little bit better, but you're going to get more detail out of Tacitus because he's going to spend a little bit more time on certain events. Tacitus, though, is also not complete, and that is something to keep in mind. I think if we had a more complete picture of what Tacitus wrote, it would be easier to compare him to Suetonius, and he would obviously have the leg up because he would have more information for each individual reign and for each period of time he's discussing. But because we don't, we kind of have to just judge Tacitus on what we do have. I've thought about it. While this is fresh in my mind, I had thought about revisiting Tacitus, and maybe I will. Now, I know people will ask about translation. To my knowledge, there really aren't that many different translations of Suetonius out there. And in fact, this one I think is done by Robert Graves. I personally am a pretty big fan of Robert Graves' translations. I don't know who they have in Oxford, but I would be really interested to know. Something to keep in mind though, if you're going to go with the Robert Graves translation, It's an older translation. Now, this version of Penguin has been revised by James Rives, but if you're getting an older version of Penguin, you're getting the older translation. I don't think you can go wrong there. I really like Robert Graves. Robert Graves very famously wrote I, Claudius, which he was inspired to do, I think, after working with this text. But Suetonius hasn't gotten the translation treatment that a lot of other really famous ancient classics have. But to me, I've never read him in Latin the way I have some others, but to me, I would say he's not really someone that you're reading for the prose style anyway, so I really do think most translations can get to the heart of him pretty easily. He seems like he is a very easily translatable author, like we're getting a good gist of what he actually wanted to say. Some ancient classics you just don't feel like that with. You feel like in translation you've lost a whole lot. I personally don't feel that way with Suetonius, but I really enjoy him, and I think if you're interested, particularly in the early emperors, especially kind of those first 5, which are easily the most entertaining, I think Suetonius is really the way to go. And I think he's very approachable, I think he's very readable, and in so many ways, to me, he's more readable than a modern nonfiction. So I hope I've encouraged you to take a chance on him if you're really curious about this period of history, because he is really, really fun to read. I know there's a lot of intimidation with ancient classics, and probably in particular with ancient nonfiction, but I really do think Suetonius is a great place to start. I would love to know down below if you have ever read Suetonius, what you think of him, but that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.